I always considered myself an independent woman. After my divorce, I moved into a small one-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, eager to start fresh. It was an old home, but cozy, with just enough space for me. More importantly, it was quiet. I thought I would finally get the peace I needed. But peace was the last thing I would find there. It started off as little things. A glass I swore I left in the sink would be sitting on the dining table. My bedroom door would be cracked open in the morning, even though I always closed it before bed. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself I was just forgetful. I was adjusting to living alone, after all. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then came the noises. At night, when everything was silent, I would hear faint shuffling from above me. At first, it was easy to ignore. Old houses make noises, right? Wood expands and contracts. Pipes groan. But this was different. It wasn't random creaks in the night. It was distinct, deliberate. Sometimes I'd hear soft taps, like fingernails lightly scraping across wood. Other times, there was a faint rustling, as if something or someone was moving up there. One night, around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed when I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. A long, slow, dragging noise. It came from directly above me, from the attic. It was unmistakably something heavy being pulled across the floor. My blood ran cold. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my phone and dialed my best friend, whispering about what I had just heard. "It's probably just the house settling," she said. But even she didn't sound convinced. She told me to call the police, but I felt ridiculous. What was I going to say? "Hi, I think my attic is haunted?" Then, thump. Louder this time. Closer, right above my bed. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I tried to shake it off. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and attempted to forget about it. But then I found something that made my stomach drop. A dirty plate sat on my kitchen counter. I hadn't used a plate the night before. Worse, it was wet. Someone had been in my house. I tried to calm myself. Maybe I had used it and just forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. And then I thought of the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and a knife from the kitchen. My hands trembled as I climbed onto a chair and reached up to push the attic hatch open. My breath was shallow, my ears straining for any noise. As the attic door swung upward, a rush of stale, putrid air hit me. It smelled like damp wood, sweat, and something else. Something rotting. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. And then, I saw him. A pair of wide, sunken eyes stared back at me from the far corner. A man curled up in a nest of old blankets, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes filthy and torn. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, and his lips were cracked and dry. He blinked once. Then he started to move. I screamed and nearly fell off the chair, but before I could even process what was happening, he lunged. I scrambled backward, the attic hatch slamming shut as I fell. My knee hit the ground hard, but I didn't stop. I ran, sprinted out of the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I made it to my car, yanked the door open and locked myself inside, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. When the police arrived, they searched the attic. They found more than just the man. They found weeks' worth of food, crackers, canned goods, bottle of water. They found my missing clothes stuffed in a garbage bag. And worst of all, they found photos of me. Some were from outside my house, some from my backyard. But the worst ones? The ones taken inside, while I was sleeping. He had been living there for at least a month, watching me, studying me, planning something. The scariest part? The attic door had a lock on the inside, which meant he had been locking himself in at night. The police arrested him, but they never figured out how he got in. No doors or windows had been broken. There was no sign of forced entry. The only thing the man would say when questioned was this: "I just wanted to be close to her." I moved out the next day. To this day, I still wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear that slow, dragging sound above me. And sometimes, I think I still do. It started on a quiet Friday night. My parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone in the house. I wasn't scared. I'd stayed alone before. The silence felt comforting, wrapping around me like a blanket. I curled up on the couch, the glow of the TV flickering across the darkened living room. A mindless sitcom played, but I wasn't really paying attention. I felt it, that strange, unsettling sensation. A presence, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my skin. At first I ignored it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But a cold shiver ran down my spine, and my pulse quickened. Some deep, primal instinct made me turn my head. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing outside my living room window. The TV's light flickered against his face, distorting his features. His mouth was twisted into a grin too wide, too forced, stretching unnaturally across his face. His eyes, wide, unblinking, bored into me, dark and hollow. And then, slowly, he knocked. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror of his presence. Then, he took a step back, and another, and melted into the darkness of my yard. I sat there, body rigid, every nerve in my body on fire. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was just some drunk wandering by. Maybe it was nothing. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of my back door creaking open. My stomach dropped. My mind screamed at me to move, but my limbs felt like lead. A shadow flickered against the hallway wall. He was inside. I bolted from the couch, feet barely touching the floor as I ran for the bathroom. My hands fumbled with the doorknob, my breath coming in panicked gasps. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my body against the cold wooden surface as if that could keep him out. Silence. Then, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Software. Unhurried. Coming down the hallway. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. I dialed 911, bringing it to my ear as the dial tone rang. The operator picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to speak, but the words felt stuck in my throat. My voice was barely a whisper. Someone is in my house. Then, the footsteps stopped, right outside the bathroom door. A long, agonizing silence stretched between us. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. And then, in a sickly, sweet voice, barely above a whisper, I heard him speak. "I know you're in there." I slapped my hand over my mouth to stop a sob from escaping. My entire body trembled as I pressed myself against the wall, as if I could somehow disappear into it. The doorknob twisted. Once, twice, then stopped. A beat of silence. Then bam! He slammed his palm against the door, the force rattling it on its hinges. I let out a small, involuntary cry, curling into myself. Then, sirens. The faint wail of approaching police cars cut through the night. A loud bang echoed through the house as the front door burst open. The doorknob stopped rattling. Footsteps, rapid this time, moving away. Then silence. Stayed frozen, too afraid to move until I heard the shouts of officers calling out. Only then did I unlock the door, my legs barely holding me up as I stumbled into the hallway. The house was empty, but he had been there. The police searched the entire property, but he was gone, vanished into the night like a phantom. And then they found something outside my window, a folded note, pressed against the glass, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. "You looked so pretty tonight. I'll come back for you." The officers stayed with me until my parents arrived, their faces ashen with worry. That night, I packed a bag and left. I never spent another night alone in that house again. And to this day, when the night is quiet and still, I swear I can hear it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, echoing through the darkness. I was 18 at the time, home alone for a few days while my parents were out of town. It was summer break, and the days were long and lazy. Nights, however, felt different. There was something eerie about being alone in a house that was usually filled with life. That night, I was curled up on the couch, lost in a Netflix binge. The only sound was the soft hum of the television and the occasional rustling of trees outside. Then, at exactly 11 p.m., a knock at the front door shattered the silence. At first, I ignored it. Maybe it was a neighbor or a package left late. But something didn't sit right. It was late. Too late for casual visits. My heart began to thump in my chest as I muted the TV and crept towards the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the peephole. 2 men stood outside. They wore dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by shadows. They weren't familiar. No delivery uniforms, no friendly smiles. Just 2 men standing too still, too silent. My stomach tightened. Then, one of them spoke. "Hello? We're looking for Mr. and Mrs. Ian. Are they home?" My blood ran cold. They knew my parents' names. Something in my gut told me not to answer. I held my breath, willing myself to stay quiet. The men exchanged glances, murmuring something under their breath. Then, without another word, they turned away. I listened closely, waiting for the sound of a car starting, footsteps fading. But there was nothing. They hadn't left. A chill crawled up my spine as I pressed myself against the door, straining to hear. A few minutes passed, the silence stretching unbearably. Then a new sound. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving along the side of the house. My breath hitched as I realized they were circling to the backyard. I tiptoed to the back window, peering through the curtain just in time to see one of them slipping through the fence gate. The second man followed, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. They whispered something. Then, one of them reached for the back door handle. A jolt of terror shot through me. My body reacted before my brain did. I grabbed my phone and bolted toward the garage, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I could barely get the words out. There are 2 men at my house. They know my parents' names. They're trying to break in. The operator's voice remained calm. Are you in a safe place? I think so. Stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. Then, a loud pop. My back door swung open. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. They were inside. I crouched behind a stack of storage bins in the garage, my heart hammering so hard I thought they would hear it. I held my breath as I listened to their movements. They were searching, moving through the living room, checking each room one by one. Then they stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the suffocating silence of the house. Then, a creak, the slow groan of weight on the stairs. They were coming up. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. The operator was still on the line. "The police are almost there," she assured me. But I barely heard her. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What did they want? Why were they so fixated on my parents? Suddenly, a flash of red and blue light filled the windows. Sirens wailed outside, a blessed, piercing sound. Then, chaos. A thunderous pounding on the front door. The men moved fast, bolting upstairs. I could hear them slamming a door shut. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" Shouts, footsteps, a scuffle, then silence. I stayed hidden until an officer found me. My limbs felt like jelly as I stumbled out of the garage, my breath coming in gasps. The men were handcuffed, being led out of my house. Their faces were blank, emotionless, as if none of this mattered to them. One of the officers approached me. "Do you know these men?" I shook my head. "No." He frowned. "They weren't trying to steal anything. They didn't take a single item." My skin prickled. "Then what were they doing?" The officer hesitated before answering. "We don't know, but the only thing they asked for was your parents." A sick feeling curled in my stomach. That night, I didn't sleep. Even with the house cleared and locked, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somewhere, someone was still watching, waiting. And that one day, they might come back. I had always loved my little apartment. Nestled on the third floor of a century-old building, its crooked floors and crown molding whispered of a time long past. The windows rattled in the wind, and the radiators groaned like restless spirits. But it was mine. Cozy, safe, a sanctuary, until the night it became a prison. It started on a Thursday, or maybe a Friday. Time blurs when you're lying awake, pulse thrumming, staring at the ceiling. The first footsteps were faint, almost playful. Creak, pause, creak. I sat up, clutching my blanket. The clock glowed 2:07 a.m. "Mrs. Wilkins?" I called out hoarsely, though my elderly neighbor couldn't climb stairs. The building was silent. Then it came again. Heavier this time. A slow, wet squelch, as though something were dragging itself down the hall. My skin prickled. The sound stopped outside my bedroom door. I held my breath. The footsteps retreated, each one louder than the last, until they reached the kitchen. A cabinet door creaked open. Glass clinked. No. I fumbled for my phone. The screen glared. No service. The Wi-Fi symbol had vanished too. Across the room, the bedroom door stood slightly ajar. The hallway beyond ink black. Then, silence. I counted to 300, each second a lifetime. When nothing stirred, I crept to the door, my bare feet flinching at the cold hardwood. The apartment was frigid, my breath visible. The kitchen light was off, the cabinet shut, but the air reeked of damp earth like a storm had blown through. The next night, it worsened. I'd barricaded the bedroom door with a chair. Foolish, but it let me sleep. Until 2:07 a.m. again. Thud. A single step just beyond the barricade. Thud. Closer. Thud. The chair screeched as the door inched open. A shadow stretched across the floor, tall, hunched, its edges wavering like smoke. I screamed, scrambling backward. The shadow paused. Then, with a sound like bones cracking, it dissolved. By the third night, I hadn't slept in 48 hours. I'd moved a knife under my pillow, checked the locks 7 times. But at 2:07 a.m., the footsteps returned. They didn't tease this time. They charged. A sprinting, frenzied stomp, stomp, stomp down the hall, shaking the walls. The bedroom door burst open, the chair splintering. I lunged for the knife, but the footsteps halted mid-air, replaced by a low, guttural growl. "Found you." The voice wasn't human. It was the sound of a throat full of mud. The footsteps resumed, slow, deliberate, circling my bed. The growl deepened into a chuckle. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was sleep paralysis, a nightmare, anything. Then silence. I opened my eyes. The closet door stood open. I never left it open. From within, something shifted. A glint of yellow eyes. A hand, blackened and clawed, gripped the doorframe. The wood sizzled where it touched. I ran. I didn't remember unlocking the front door, didn't feel the icy stairs beneath my feet. I pounded on Mrs. Wilkins' door until she answered, her face ashen. "They're in the walls," she hissed, yanking me inside. "They've been here for years." The police found nothing. No broken locks, no intruders, just a single footprint in my closet, a boot print caked in mud that reeked of rot. They tracked it to the door, but the trail ended there. No prints in the hall, none outside. "Old building," one officer shrugged. "Pipes knock, floorboards warp." But I saw his hand tremble as he photographed the footprint. I moved out a week later, threw half my belongings away. Tainted, I told myself. But last night in my new high-rise, I heard it again. Creak. Pause. Creak. And my closet door, which I'd nailed shut, began to rattle. I live alone on a large plot of land in Wyoming, miles away from my nearest neighbor. The isolation never really bothered me. I liked the quiet, the open sky, the way the land stretched endlessly in every direction. But one spring evening, after days of relentless rain, I realized just how vulnerable I really was. It was a Sunday. The storm had finally begun to ease, the pounding rain tapering into a steady drizzle. I had just finished cleaning up my dinner when I heard it. A knock at the door. It was slow and deliberate, 3 evenly spaced raps that echoed through the empty house. My stomach twisted. I wasn't expecting anyone. Out here, unexpected visitors were rare and usually unwelcome. Cautiously, I approached the door, peeking through the peephole. A man stood on my porch, drenched from head to toe. His clothes clung to him, water pooling around his feet. He had no backpack, no visible camping gear, just the soaked clothes on his back, and an odd, almost too calm expression. I cracked the door slightly, keeping my foot braced against it. "Can I help you?" He smiled. A little too wide, a little too forced. "I was camping nearby, got caught in the rain. Thought I could wait it out, but my tent got flooded. Mind if I stay here for the night?" Something felt off. His face was clean. Too clean for someone who had supposedly been roughing it in the woods. His hands, too. No dirt, no scratches, no signs of struggle against the elements. And his eyes, they held no desperation, no urgency, just a strange, unsettling calm. I tightened my grip on the door. "I can call someone for you, get you a ride into town." He shook his head. "No need. Just need a place to dry off, just for a few hours." "Sorry, I said firmly. "I can't help you." For a moment, he didn't move. The smile lingered, frozen on his face. Then, slowly, he nodded, stepping back off the porch. "All right," he said. "Thanks anyway." I watched as he walked away, disappearing into the tree line. My pulse pounded in my ears, every instinct screaming at me that I had just dodged something dangerous. But I wanted to believe it was over, that he was just an odd drifter who would move on to the next house, if there even was another house within walking distance. But later that night, I learned I was wrong. Hours passed. The rain picked up again, tapping against my windows, masking the sounds of the world outside. I tried to push the encounter from my mind, convincing myself I had overreacted. But then, through the downpour, I saw it. An orange glow flickering through the trees. A fire. My throat tightened as I stepped closer to the window. Through the rain and the darkness, I could make out a figure standing beside the fire. The same man from earlier. But now, he wasn't just standing. He was holding something. Something long. Halleck. A rifle. A jolt of fear surged through me. My fingers fumbled for my phone as I backed away from the window. My mind raced. Was he waiting for me to come outside? Was he planning to break in? I called the police, my voice barely steady enough to relay my address. They told me to stay inside, to lock all doors and wait. I hung up, gripping my own firearm, my knuckles white. And then, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching over the wet gravel outside, coming closer. Then, the knock. Not a polite knock, not the cautious tapping from earlier. This was harder, harsher. He pounded against the door, rattling it in its frame. Then, a heavy thud. Another. I realized with stomach-churning dread that he was hitting the door with the stock of his rifle, trying to break in. My heart slammed against my ribs. My grip on my gun tightened. "I have a weapon!" I shouted, hoping it would make him stop. It didn't. The next hit was even harder, splintering the wood slightly. I had no choice. I raised my gun, aimed at the doorframe, and fired. The sound was deafening. My ears rang, my own breath loud in the silence that followed. When my vision cleared, I saw it. The darkness beyond the doorway. No movement, no shadow. He was gone. Minutes passed. Then headlights. The police arrived, combing the woods, scouring the area. But the man was nowhere to be found. They did find something, though. Near the fire pit, partially buried in the mud, they uncovered a duffel bag. Inside, a knife, duct tape, rope, gloves. They called it a burglary kit. I call it a murder kit. That was months ago. The police never found him. They never identified him. And though I changed my locks, added cameras, and reinforced my doors, I still wake up at night, wondering if one day he'll come back. Watching, waiting, for another rainy night. I was 17, home alone one night while my mom worked the graveyard shift. It wasn't the first time I'd spent the night by myself, but something about that night felt different. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every creak, every shift of the walls as they settled. I tried to ignore it, burying myself under my blankets and scrolling through my phone until sleep eventually won. I don't know what woke me up at first. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the shift in the air. But as my mind crawled out of sleep, I heard it. Footsteps downstairs. At first, I thought it was my mom getting home early. I glanced at my phone. 3:30 a.m. That didn't make sense. She wasn't supposed to be off until morning. My heart started pounding as I strained to listen. The footsteps weren't hurried. They weren't the familiar shuffle of someone exhausted after a long shift. No, these were slow, deliberate. A heavy boot stepping carefully on the hardwood floors, pausing between each step. Listening. I held my breath. The footsteps didn't stop. Whoever it was, they were moving through the house, room by room, checking every corner. Something was wrong. I sat up, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was the wind, or an animal outside. But then, a door creaked open, not slammed, not pushed, just eased open with a patience that made my skin crawl. I froze. The sound came from the kitchen. I knew every sound in that house, and that wasn't a door that should be opening by itself. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I strained my ears, desperate to hear something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. Nothing. I had to check. I had to make sure I wasn't just hearing things. Moving slowly, I turned on my bedside lamp, the warm glow flooding my room. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step toward my bedroom door. The footsteps stopped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I waited, gripping the doorknob, listening for any sign of movement. Still, silence. Slowly, I turned the knob, easing my door open just a crack. The hallway was empty. The dim glow from the streetlight outside filtered through the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. Step by step, I made my way down the stairs. The house was dark, but everything looked normal at first glance. The living room was just as I had left it. TV remote on the coffee table, my PlayStation still in place. No shattered glass, no open doors. But then, I saw it. A single, muddy footprint near the kitchen entrance. My stomach dropped. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the room. And then I locked eyes with him. A man was sitting at my dining table. His face was covered by a dark mask, only his eyes visible beneath the dim light from the hallway. He sat perfectly still, hands resting on the wooden surface, fingers curled slightly as if he were waiting for something. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but my body was frozen in terror. And then, as if sensing my panic, he tilted his head. That was enough to break me. I turned and bolted, sprinting up the stairs 2 at a time. I slammed my door shut, locked it, and grabbed my phone with shaking hands. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I dialed 911. The operator picked up almost instantly. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the fear seeped into every word as I whispered what was happening. And then, I heard something worse. Footsteps, not downstairs, not moving away, but coming up the stairs. Slow, steady, unhurried. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. The operator was still on the line, asking me questions, but I couldn't answer. My entire body was focused on listening. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Then, silence. I stared at the thin line of light under my door, waiting, hoping. And then, a shadow shifted just outside my door. Whoever he was standing there, listening. I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. My mind raced. If he tried the door, would the lock hold? What if he had a weapon? My phone was still in my hand, the operator still trying to get my attention. Then, the doorknob rattled. I nearly dropped the phone. The door shook as he tested it once, then again. My breath hitched as I watched the handle twist back and forth, as if he was deciding whether or not to break it down. And then, another sound. Distant but unmistakable. Sirens. I wasn't sure if he heard them at first, but then the doorknob stilled. The shadow outside my door hesitated. A long, tense moment passed. Then, footsteps, retreating this time, faster, more urgent. I listened as he rushed down the stairs, heard the front door creak open, and then he was gone. By the time the police arrived, my hands were still shaking. They searched the house, but he had vanished. I rented a house for 2 nights while traveling. It was a last-minute decision. A quiet little place in a small town, surrounded by thick woods. The photos online made it look cozy, and the reviews were decent. People said it was peaceful, private, exactly what I wanted. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was that an upstairs light was already on. Odd, but not alarming. Maybe the last guest had forgotten to turn it off, or perhaps the host had left it on for me. Either way, I shrugged it off. The house itself was charming, rustic but well-maintained, with an old-fashioned wooden staircase that creaked under my weight as I carried my bag upstairs. The bedroom was comfortable enough. A large bed, a closet, a single window facing the darkened tree line. Everything seemed fine. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and settled in for the night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. A sound. A low, dull thud. At first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The wind outside rustled the trees, but the sound I had heard wasn't from outside. It had come from inside the house. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate creaks moved through the hallway outside my bedroom door. My pulse spiked. It wasn't just the house settling. Someone was out there, moving. For a moment, I considered that maybe it was the Airbnb host checking on something. Maybe another guest had arrived by mistake. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet barely touching the cold floor. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. No service. Of course. I cursed under my breath. The footsteps grew closer, slower, as if whoever was out there knew I was awake. I pressed my hand against the doorknob to keep it from turning. My heart was slamming against my ribs, the sound of my own pulse roaring in my ears. Then, it moved. The doorknob twisted sharply, jerking against my palm. I stifled a gasp. Then, before I could react, the door slammed open. I barely had time to stumble back before I saw him. A man standing in the doorway. Tall, unkempt. His clothes were filthy, tattered, like he had been wearing them for days. His eyes were wild, his face twisted into something between rage and desperation. For a split second, we locked eyes. And in that moment, I knew I was not supposed to be here. He lunged. Pure instinct took over. I shoved the door with all my strength, slamming it back into him. He let out a guttural growl as I twisted the lock just in time. Bang! He slammed his fists against the door, rattling it violently. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the nightstand. My hands fumbled for anything I could use as a weapon, a lamp, a chair, anything. But before I could react further, the pounding stopped. Silence. I held my breath, my entire body tense, waiting for the next attack. But then, I heard him move. Heavy, rapid footsteps. He was running, down the stairs, through the house. Then, the front door burst open. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence that followed. Then, cautiously, I approached the bedroom door, my heart still hammering. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear. Nothing. After a long moment, I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The house was empty. Still shaking, I grabbed my keys and ran downstairs, my bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. The living room looked the same, except the couch cushions were slightly out of place. The kitchen chair was pulled back from the table, as if someone had been sitting there. And then I saw it. A trail of muddy footprints leading down the basement stairs. My stomach turned to ice. The basement door was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the frame. Slowly, with every ounce of courage I could muster, I reached for the light switch and flipped it on. The light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space. And then I saw it. A makeshift bed, old dirty blankets piled into the corner, empty food wrappers, a plastic water bottle, scraps of paper. Someone had been living here. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't just a break-in. Whoever that man was, he had been staying in the house long before I arrived. I ran back upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom until morning. At dawn, I packed my things and left the house without a second glance. Later, the police found evidence that someone had been squatting there for weeks. They searched the property but found no trace of the man. The host claimed to have no idea how long it had been going on. And the strangest part? The listing for that house disappeared from the Airbnb site the very next day. I never found out who he was or where he went.